In this novel, we delve into the case of the West Memphis Three, exploring their controversial convictions for the brutal murders of 3 young boys. Join us as we uncover the twists and turns of this complex and captivating story, examining the evidence, the trial, and the ongoing search for the truth. Stay updated and engage with fellow readers by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Together, let's uncover the truth behind this tragic and fascinating story. Chapter 1: Introducing the Victims and the Community. The small town of West Memphis, Arkansas was a close-knit community. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody looked out for each other. It was a place where children played freely in the streets, and families felt safe in their homes.
But that all changed on May 6, 1993, when the bodies of 3 8-year-old boys were found in a wooded area near their homes.
The victims were Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. The news of the murders spread like wildfire, and the entire town was in shock. The families of the victims were devastated, and the community was left wondering who could commit such a heinous crime. As the investigation began, the police questioned anyone who might have information about the murders. The residents of West Memphis were on edge, and fear hung in the air like a thick fog. One of the first suspects was a man named John Mark Byers, the stepfather of Christopher Byers. He had a history of violence and had been in trouble with the law before. The police questioned him, but he denied any involvement in the murders. The detectives continued their search for answers, but it seemed like they were hitting a dead end. The town was on edge, and everyone was looking for someone to blame. As the days passed, the community rallied together to support the families of the victims. They held vigils and memorials, and the outpouring of love and support was overwhelming. But underneath it all, the fear remained. Who could do something so unspeakable? And would they ever be caught? Chapter 2: The Discovery of the Bodies. The search for the missing boys had been going on for days, and the entire town was on edge. It seemed like the police and the volunteers had searched everywhere, but the boys were nowhere to be found. Then, on May 6th, a search party stumbled upon the boys' bodies in a ditch near their homes. The news spread quickly, and the entire town was in shock. The victims had been bound, beaten, and mutilated. It was clear that they had suffered greatly before their deaths. The police quickly began their investigation, and suspicion soon fell on a group of teenage boys known as the West Memphis Three. Damian Eccles, Jesse Miss Kelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin were known to be outsiders in the town, and they had a reputation for being troublemakers. The police questioned them and quickly built a case against them. They claimed that the boys were killed as part of a satanic ritual, and they pointed to the West Memphis Three's interest in the occult as evidence. The town was outraged, and the families of the victims demanded justice. The West Memphis Three were arrested and charged with murder, and the town breathed a sigh of relief. But not everyone was convinced. Some residents of West Memphis believed that the police had rushed to judgment and had arrested the wrong people. They believed that the real killer was still out there, and that the West Memphis Three were innocent. The investigation continued, but the town was already divided. The families of the victims were convinced that the right people had been arrested, while others were convinced that justice had not been served. Chapter 3: The Arrests of the West Memphis Three. The arrests of the West Memphis Three sent shockwaves through the town. Damian Eccles, Jesse Miss Kelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin were just teenagers, but they were now accused of a horrific crime that had rocked the entire community. The police had built their case against the West Memphis Three on circumstantial evidence. They claimed that the boys' interest in the occult, their outsider status, and their supposed confessions to friends were enough to prove their guilt. But there were many in the town who were not convinced. They believed that the West Memphis Three were innocent and that the police had rushed to judgment. The families of the accused were in shock. They couldn't believe that their sons had been arrested for a crime they didn't commit. They knew that their boys were different and that they had struggled to fit in, but they never believed that they were capable of murder. The town was divided, and tensions were high. The families of the victims were outraged that anyone would doubt the police's investigation, while others were convinced that the real killer was still out there. The West Memphis Three were held in custody as the investigation continued. The town waited anxiously for the trial to begin, hoping that justice would be served and the truth would come out. But for the families of the accused, the wait was unbearable. They knew that their sons were innocent and that their lives would never be the same again. Chapter 4: The Trial. The trial of the West Memphis Three was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution argued that the West Memphis Three were guilty of the murders, pointing to the supposed confession of Jesse Kelly Jr. and the circumstantial evidence against the defendants. They portrayed Damien Eccles as a devil worshiper and painted Jason Baldwin as his loyal follower. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the police had rushed to judgment and had targeted the West Memphis Three because they were outsiders. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence linking the defendants to the crime scene and argued that Jesse Kelly Jr.'s confession was coerced. The trial was emotional and intense. The families of the victims were in attendance, weeping as they listened to the evidence against the West Memphis Three. The families of the accused were equally emotional, clinging to the hope that their sons would be found innocent. As the trial dragged on, tensions in the town continued to rise. The community was divided, with some convinced of the guilt of the West Memphis Three and others determined to prove their innocence. In the end, the jury found Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin guilty of murder and sentenced them to life in prison. Jesse Kelly Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life plus 40 years. The families of the victims were relieved that justice had been served, but the families of the accused were devastated. They knew that their sons were innocent and that they had been convicted of a crime they didn't commit. Chapter 5: The Verdict. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the judge read out the verdict. The families of the victims cheered while the families of the accused collapsed in tears. Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jesse Kelly Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life plus 40 years. As the defendants were let out of the courtroom, the families of the accused were inconsolable. They knew that their sons were innocent and that they had been railroaded by a justice system that was more interested in convicting someone than finding the truth. The community of West Memphis was equally divided. Some were relieved that justice had been served, while others were outraged that 3 innocent teenagers had been convicted of a crime they didn't commit. In the days and weeks that followed, the families of the West Memphis Three began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They were determined to prove the innocence of their sons and launched a campaign to bring attention to the flaws in the case against them. The families of the victims, meanwhile, tried to move on from the tragedy that had befallen them. They struggled to come to terms with the loss of their loved ones and the knowledge that the people responsible for their deaths might never be brought to justice. As the dust settled, it became clear that the West Memphis Three case was far from over. The community was still divided, and the families of the accused were still fighting to clear their names. Chapter 6: The Aftermath. The verdict in the trial of the West Memphis Three sent shockwaves through the town of West Memphis and beyond. The families of the accused were devastated, and the families of the victims were relieved that justice had been served. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the case was far from over. Supporters of the West Memphis Three began to speak out, pointing out the flaws in the case against them. They argued that the evidence was weak and that the prosecution had relied too heavily on the testimony of unreliable witnesses. They also pointed out that the police had failed to investigate other possible suspects. The families of the accused launched a campaign to raise awareness about the case, hoping to draw attention to the injustice that had been done. They held rallies and fundraisers, and they spoke to anyone who would listen, hoping to convince people of their son's innocence. Meanwhile, the families of the victims struggled to come to terms with their loss. They tried to find closure in the knowledge that the people responsible for their loved ones' deaths had been brought to justice, but they couldn't help but wonder if the right people had been convicted. The town of West Memphis was divided, with some people believing that the West Memphis Three were innocent and others convinced that they were guilty. The case had become a national sensation, and people from all over the country were following it closely. As the months turned into years, the families of the West Memphis Three refused to give up. They continued to fight for justice, hoping that one day their sons would be exonerated and the true killers would be brought to justice. Chapter 7: New Evidence. The case of the West Memphis Three seemed to have reached a dead end. Despite the efforts of their supporters, the three young men remained in prison, and the investigation into the murders had gone cold. But then, in a stunning turn of events, new evidence came to light that could change everything. The new evidence came in the form of DNA testing. Samples taken from the crime scene were retested, and the results were shocking. The DNA did not match any of the West Memphis Three, but it did match an unknown male. This meant that there was someone else out there who was connected to the murders. The discovery of the new DNA evidence sparked a renewed investigation into the case. The police began to re-examine old evidence and interview witnesses again, hoping to find new leads. They also began to investigate other possible suspects, including people who had been overlooked in the original investigation. As the investigation continued, the families of the West Memphis Three grew more and more hopeful. They believed that the new evidence would clear their sons' names and finally bring the true killers to justice. Their supporters also grew more vocal, calling for a new trial and urging the authorities to take the new evidence seriously. But not everyone was convinced. Some people in the town of West Memphis believed that the new evidence was just a ploy by the defense to get their clients off the hook. They argued that the evidence was inconclusive and that the West Memphis Three were still the most likely suspects. Despite the controversy, the investigation continued. The police worked tirelessly to follow up on every lead and gather as much evidence as possible. They knew that they had a long road ahead of them, but they were determined to find the truth. Chapter 8: The Appeals Process. The discovery of the new DNA evidence had given the supporters of the West Memphis Three renewed hope. They believed that it would lead to a new trial and ultimately to the exoneration of the three young men. But the road to justice would not be an easy one. The defense team immediately filed an appeal based on the new evidence. They argued that the DNA results showed that the West Memphis Three had been wrongfully convicted and that they deserved a new trial. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that the evidence was inconclusive and that it did not prove the innocence of the defendants. The appeals process was a long and arduous one. The case went through several rounds of appeals, with each side presenting their arguments to higher and higher courts. It seemed like there would never be a resolution to the case. But finally, after years of legal wrangling, the Arkansas Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. The court carefully examined the new evidence and the arguments made by both sides. In a landmark decision, the court overturned the convictions of the West Memphis Three and ordered a new trial. The decision was met with both jubilation and skepticism. The supporters of the West Memphis Three were overjoyed that justice was finally being served, but they also knew that the new trial would be a difficult one. The prosecution had not given up, and they were determined to see the three young men put behind bars once again. The new trial was set to begin in just a few months, and tensions in the town of West Memphis were high. Everyone knew that this trial would be the most important one yet. The fate of the West Memphis Three, and the truth about the murders of the three young boys, hung in the balance. Chapter 9: The Alford Plea. The new trial of the West Memphis Three began with great fanfare. The supporters of the defendants were out in force, with signs and banners proclaiming their innocence. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the prosecution had not given up on their case. The evidence presented by the prosecution was largely circumstantial, but they argued that it was enough to prove the guilt of the defendants. The defense team, however, presented a compelling case, using the new DNA evidence and witness testimony to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. As the trial came to a close, it became clear that the verdict could go either way. But then, something unexpected happened. The West Memphis Three were offered an Alford plea. This meant that they could plead guilty to the charges against them, but maintain their innocence. It was a controversial decision, but one that the defendants ultimately accepted. The Alford plea meant that the West Memphis Three would be released from prison, but they would not be exonerated. The prosecution had won their case, but they had also allowed the defendants to maintain their innocence. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a victory for the West Memphis Three, as they were finally free after years of imprisonment. Others saw it as a travesty of justice, as the true killers of the three young boys had still not been brought to justice. The defendants themselves were relieved to be out of prison, but they knew that their fight for justice was far from over. They continued to work with their supporters to clear their names and find the true killers of the three young boys. Chapter 10: Life After Prison. As the West Memphis Three adjusted to life outside of prison, they faced a number of challenges. They had spent almost 2 decades behind bars and had missed out on many of the experiences that most people take for granted. For Jason Baldwin, life outside of prison was a chance to start over. He moved to Seattle and began working on his education, eventually earning a degree in psychology. He also became an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking out against the flaws in the justice system that had led to his wrongful conviction. Jesse Kelly struggled more with life outside of prison. He had never developed the same coping mechanisms as Jason and Damien, and found it difficult to adjust to life outside of prison. He was diagnosed with PTSD and struggled with addiction, but continued to work with his supporters to clear his name. Damien Eccles faced his own challenges after leaving prison. He had spent most of his adult life behind bars, and found it difficult to adjust to the outside world. But he also had a newfound sense of purpose, and became an advocate for other wrongfully convicted prisoners. Despite the challenges they faced, the West Memphis Three were determined to clear their names. They worked with their supporters to raise awareness of their case and to push for a new investigation into the murders. Over the years, their efforts paid off. The case received widespread media attention, with documentaries and books bringing attention to their plight. And in 2010, new DNA evidence was discovered that cast even more doubt on their guilt. As the years passed, the West Memphis Three continued to fight for justice. And in 2011, they finally received some measure of vindication. They were released from their Alford plea, which meant that their convictions were vacated and they were declared innocent. It was a long and difficult journey, but the West Memphis Three had finally been exonerated. They had fought for their freedom and their innocence, and in the end, they had prevailed. Chapter 11: The Continuing Investigation. Even after the West Memphis Three were released from prison, the investigation into the murders of the three boys continued. Many people believed that the true killers were still out there, and the search for the truth continued. Over the years, a number of alternate suspects had been investigated. Some people believed that the murders were the work of a group of local teenagers, while others suspected that a lone killer was responsible. One of the most promising leads came in 2007, when a new suspect emerged, Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims. Hobbs had a troubled history and had been known to abuse his stepson. And new DNA evidence linked him to the scene of the crime. But the case against Hobbs was never strong enough to bring him to trial. And while many people believed that he was the true killer, there was never enough evidence to prove it. Despite the lack of a definitive answer, the case continued to fascinate and haunt people. It became a symbol of the flaws in the justice system and the dangers of rushing to judgment. And it inspired a new generation of advocates for criminal justice reform. For the West Memphis Three, the search for the truth was a deeply personal quest. They had spent years behind bars for a crime they did not commit, and they were determined to find out what had really happened to the three boys. Over the years, they continued to work with their supporters to push for a new investigation into the case. And in 2019, they finally got their wish. The Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a new hearing to consider new DNA evidence that could shed light on the case. It was a bittersweet victory for the West Memphis Three. They had been exonerated and had finally been able to move on with their lives, but the case still haunted them. They knew that the true killers were still out there, and they were determined to see justice served. Chapter 12: The Media Coverage. The case of the West Memphis Three drew national attention, in part due to the media coverage that it received. From the initial shock and horror of the discovery of the bodies to the controversial verdict, the media was there to capture every moment. At first, the media was primarily focused on the investigation and the search for the killers. News outlets from across the country descended upon West Memphis, interviewing anyone who would talk and speculating about the identity of the murderer. Some reporters even insinuated that the killings were part of a satanic ritual, which only added to the sense of panic and fear in the town. As the trial approached, the media's attention shifted to the courtroom drama. Journalists from every major network were in attendance, eager to capture the latest developments in the case. The trial was broadcast on television and the radio, allowing people across the country to tune in and follow the proceedings in real time. After the verdict was delivered, the media's coverage of the case took on a new tone. Many journalists were critical of the verdict and the way that the trial was conducted. Some questioned whether the evidence presented was sufficient to convict the West Memphis Three, while others accused the prosecution of using scare tactics and sensationalism to sway the jury. Despite the controversy surrounding the case, it wasn't until the release of the documentary Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, that the public became truly invested in the fate of the West Memphis Three. The documentary, which was released in 1996, presented a compelling case that the three teenagers were innocent and had been wrongfully convicted. The documentary sparked a wave of support for the West Memphis Three, with people from around the world rallying to their cause. Numerous books, articles, and documentaries were produced, further highlighting the flaws in the prosecution's case and the need for justice for the three young men. The media coverage of the case had a profound impact on the public's perception of the West Memphis Three. Initially seen as devil-worshipping killers, the three teenagers became symbols of a broken justice system and the power of the media to influence public opinion. The case also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of preserving the rights of the accused. Chapter 13: The Personal Lives of the West Memphis Three. As the years passed, Damien, Jesse, and Jason had become household names. They were known throughout the world as the West Memphis Three, and their case had become synonymous with injustice. But while their public persona was that of a united front, the reality was far more complicated. Damien had struggled with the weight of his newfound fame. He had become a spokesperson for the wrongfully convicted, a role he never expected to play. He was often asked to speak at events, give interviews, and write articles, all while trying to navigate life as a free man. Jesse had a difficult time adjusting to life outside of prison. He had spent half his life behind bars, and he struggled to cope with the outside world. He was often withdrawn and quiet, and he rarely spoke to anyone except for Damien and Jason. Jason, on the other hand, had embraced his newfound freedom with open arms. He had a new girlfriend, a job, and a new circle of friends. He was determined to put his past behind him and start a new life. Despite their different experiences, the three remained close. They spoke to each other every day and often visited each other's homes. They had a bond that only they could understand. Their families had also been greatly affected by the case. Many of them had been forced to put their lives on hold while they fought for their loved ones' freedom. They had spent countless hours on the phone, writing letters, and attending rallies. But the families were also united by their shared experience. They had formed a close-knit community, bound together by their love for the West Memphis Three. As the years passed, the media attention died down, and the West Memphis Three slowly faded from the public eye. But for those who had been affected by the case, the memories remained. Chapter 14, The Legacy of the Case. The town of West Memphis had never seen anything like the case of the West Memphis Three. The gruesome murders of 3 young boys and the conviction of 3 teenagers had shaken the community to its core. But as the years passed, the impact of the case began to extend far beyond West Memphis. The trial and conviction of the West Memphis Three had sparked a national debate about the justice system and the treatment of minors in the criminal justice system. Many argued that the teenagers had been railroaded by a flawed investigation and a biased legal system. The case highlighted the dangers of relying too heavily on circumstantial evidence and the need for thorough investigations that consider all possibilities. The legacy of the case extended beyond legal and criminal justice issues. The West Memphis Three had become symbols of the fight against wrongful convictions and a rallying cry for advocates of criminal justice reform. Their case had brought attention to the issue of false confessions, the pressure that suspects face from law enforcement, and the need for proper legal representation. The case had also highlighted the power of the media to influence public perception and opinion. The documentaries and books that had been made about the case had exposed flaws in the investigation and the prosecution's case, and had played a significant role in bringing public attention to the case. The media coverage had also helped dehumanize the West Memphis Three, making them more than just names on a court document and helping to rally support for their cause. As the legacy of the case continued to evolve, there were those who remained committed to finding the truth about what had happened to the 3 young victims. The investigation into the murders remained open, and many hoped that one day the true killer or killers would be brought to justice. Chapter 15, The Truth. The tension was palpable in the small room as the 3 defendants sat, each waiting for the truth to be revealed. They had been through so much in the past few years, and now they were finally going to find out who had really killed those 3 innocent boys. The detective entered the room and took a deep breath. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have finally found the person responsible for the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers." The room was silent as the detective continued. "The DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene has conclusively linked the killer to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch." The defendant sat stunned, unable to speak. This was the person who had been pointing the finger at them all these years, the person who had convinced the authorities of their guilt. The detective continued, "We also have evidence that suggests Hobbs had a motive for the murders. He had a history of violence, including a documented incident where he had beaten his wife with a belt." The room erupted in emotion as the defendants and their families finally felt the weight lifted off their shoulders. It was as if the entire town of West Memphis let out a collective sigh of relief. The true killer had been found, and the West Memphis Three could finally move on with their lives.